He walked into the school with pride, but froze when he saw a little girl scrubbing the bathroom floor with trembling hands. A millionaire CEO who had seen everything, yet nothing prepared him for the moment that would change his life forever. But before we dive into today's emotional story, I'd love to know, where are you watching me from, and what time is it right now where you are? Ethan Carter, the 32-year-old millionaire CEO known for his sharp blue eyes and perfectly tailored suits, had walked into many places of prestige before, conference halls filled with applause, universities echoing with ambition, and boardrooms humming with power. But today, as his polished shoes clicked against the worn-out floor of a modest public school, there was a different kind of weight pressing on his chest, one he couldn't quite explain. Students along the hallways whispered in awe, some with wide eyes, others daring to point shyly as if they couldn't believe a man of such stature stood in their midst. Yet Ethan's gaze, though sharp and commanding, seemed distant, as though his mind were caught between the glossy image of who he had become and the faint shadow of who he used to be. He walked toward the auditorium with a measured stride, prepared to deliver yet another motivational talk about success, perseverance, and dreams, but deep inside, the words he had rehearsed felt hollow compared to the quiet storm stirring in his heart, and just when his steps echoed with authority, a sound interrupted the rhythm, a faint splash of water, irregular yet persistent, accompanied by the rough scrape of a brush against tiles. He slowed, his instincts sharpened by years of leading empires but softened by something more human, more vulnerable, a curiosity he couldn't ignore. His head tilted toward the sound, and instead of continuing to the grand stage where teachers awaited him, he let his polished shoes turn down a dimly lit hallway, a place where the air smelled faintly of detergent mixed with neglect. A place not meant for the eyes of guests, let alone a millionaire CEO, and with each step forward, the noise grew clearer, pulling him like an invisible thread, and then, as his shadow stretched along the cracked tiles, he stopped abruptly, frozen by the sight before him. A little girl, no older than 8, with skin glowing under the harsh flicker of the fluorescent bulb, small hands red from scrubbing, knees pressed painfully against the wet floor, and hair falling over her weary face as she dragged a brush across the dirty tiles. For a moment, Ethan forgot to breathe, the image too jarring to process. What was a child doing here, in this condition, while others sat in classrooms listening to lessons? His mind raced with disbelief, anger, sorrow, confusion, each emotion rising and colliding as he gripped the doorframe, and in that instant the world outside, the prestige, the applause waiting in the auditorium, the importance of his status, faded into silence, replaced by the single heartbreaking question beating against his ribs like a drum. Why was a child cleaning a school bathroom instead of learning in a classroom where she belonged? Ethan cleared his throat softly, a sound meant to be gentle but still carrying the authority of a man who was used to being heard, and the little girl instantly flinched, her thin shoulders tightening as if someone had struck her, the stiff brush nearly slipping from her raw fingers before she clutched it tighter, afraid to let go of the one thing that gave her a sense of purpose. Her wide brown eyes darted up for a fraction of a second, shimmering with fear and surprise, then quickly fell back to the dirty tiles as though the floor itself was safer than the piercing gaze of a stranger in a suit, and Ethan, who had silenced boardrooms with a single look, suddenly felt powerless, almost guilty, for frightening a child who already looked far too burdened for her age, so he allowed his voice to soften, losing its usual edge, and spoke carefully. "Hey, shouldn't you be in class right now?" The question echoed in the cramped bathroom, bouncing off the cracked walls, but instead of answering immediate the girl hesitated, her lips trembling, her breath uneven, as though she had to weigh every word with care, and finally, in a tone that carried both shame and resolve, she whispered, I can't right now. I need to finish this." And the way she spoke made Ethan's chest tighten because there was no laziness in her voice, no childish excuse, only the crushing honesty of someone forced to grow up too soon. He studied her carefully, his eyes tracing every detail, the way her shoes were worn down at the heels, almost split apart, the faded dress clinging loosely to her thin frame, the way her knees pressed against the wet floor leaving faint marks on her fragile skin, and most of all, the redness on her small fingers, skin rubbed raw from hours of scrubbing against unforgiving tiles, and it struck him harder than any harsh word ever had that this child, who should have been holding pencils and books, was instead clutching a stiff brush as though it were her only weapon against the world. Something in him shifted, a crack forming in the armor he had built over years of wealth and power, the strict mask of the businessman slipping as he crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level, speaking again, but this time with a tone laced with reluctant tenderness. "What's your name?" The girl froze for a heartbeat, her lips pressed together tightly as if even her name was something fragile she should protect. But then she inhaled a shaky breath, lifted her chin just enough to show a flicker of courage, and answered, "Amara. Amara Johnson." Each syllable pronounced with careful dignity as though she wanted him to remember it, as though her name was the only possession she truly owned. Ethan repeated it silently in his mind, Amara Johnson, tasting the weight of it, the innocence wrapped inside strength, the quiet pride hidden behind her timid voice, and though her tone was fragile, behind it was a spark of bravery that stirred something deep inside him, a memory he had long buried, of his own younger self once standing small before adults who had power over his life. And he realized with startling clarity that this encounter was not random, that fate had drawn him into this dim hallway to see a reflection of the pain he had once endured, and the pull in his chest grew stronger, almost unbearable, as he studied her hunched figure, her determination, her silent cry for help written in every movement. Questions hammered inside his mind. Who had forced her into this? Where were her teachers? Why wasn't anyone protecting her? And yet above all, one thought pressed harder than the rest, a cliffhanger that carved itself into his soul. What kind of heartbreaking circumstance could possibly force such a young girl, with eyes meant to dream and hands meant to learn, to be here on her knees scrubbing a school bathroom floor instead of sitting in a classroom where she truly belonged? Ethan slowly lowered himself onto one knee beside the little girl, the polished fabric of his expensive suit brushing against the damp floor as he bent down to her level, a gesture so uncharacteristic for a man of his stature that even he felt a strange unfamiliarity in the movement. But in that moment he didn't care about appearances, wealth, or power. He cared only about the fragile child crouched before him, clutching a brush as though her life depended on it. So he steadied his voice, gentle but firm, and asked, "Amara, why are you doing this? Who told you to clean?" The question lingered like a whisper of conscience in the air, and Amara's small body tensed, her thin shoulders trembling as though she had been exposed, her lips parting but no words escaping at first, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, until finally she forced the words out in a voice barely audible. "Mr. Williams, the janitor, he gives me a little money." And though her tone was soft, the confession cut through Ethan like a blade, for it was not only the words but the shame with which she carried them that made his heart ache, as if she believed she had to justify her suffering. Her eyes began to glisten, moisture gathering at the corners, but she fought fiercely against the tears, her little jaw tightening as though she had promised herself she wouldn't cry. And then with a sudden burst of bravery that startled even her, she spoke again, her voice trembling yet clear. "Sir, I clean here so I can buy medicine for my mommy. She says school is important. She tells me every day never to miss class. But how can I sit in class when she can't even breathe without medicine?" The words spilled out of her like a river she had been holding back, and with each syllable, Ethan felt as though a mirror had been thrust in front of him, forcing him to see not only her pain, but fragments of his own past. The hungry nights he had endured as a boy, the helplessness of watching his mother wither away while he was too small, too powerless to save her, the hollow ache of being motherless too soon, and as he stared into Amara's determined little face, he saw not just a girl forced into hardship, but a reflection of his own lost childhood, and the tightness in his throat grew unbearable, choking him with memories he had buried under layers of success and pride. For the first time in years his composure faltered, his eyes burning as though they, too, might betray him with tears, and yet he forced himself to stay present, to listen, to absorb the weight of what she was telling him, because he knew that this was no ordinary child's complaint. This was survival speaking through the fragile voice of an 8-year-old, and every instinct inside him screamed that this was the moment that could define the rest of her life. The silence that followed her confession was heavy, filled with the sound of dripping water and the faint hum of the flickering light above them. And in that silence, Ethan's mind raced, colliding between rage at the injustice, sorrow for the child, and a rising determination that he couldn't yet name. And as he watched her clutch the brush tighter, knuckles white with desperation, he realized that the question was no longer about what had forced her into this situation, but about what he, Ethan Carter, a man who once knew the sting of helplessness, would do now. Would he walk away like so many others, blind to the suffering in front of them? Or would he finally step in and become the very person he once wished had stepped in for him? Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, his hand pressing against the cool marble wall as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. Amara's fragile confession thundering in his ears like the sound of his own past clawing its way back into the present. And though he had walked away only moments ago, his heart refused to carry him any farther, dragging him back into the raw, unhealed memories of his own childhood, when he too had once stood by a bedside and begged the heavens for a miracle that never came, when he too had felt the crushing helplessness of being a child with a burden far too heavy for such small shoulders. And for years he had tried to silence those memories with the noise of wealth, the applause of boardrooms, the sterile comfort of penthouse walls. But nothing had ever touched the core of his soul the way this little girl's trembling voice had, a voice that somehow carried both the fragility of her years and the steel of her determination. And now, as he turned back into the bathroom, his chest tightened with a storm of emotions he hadn't let himself feel in decades, his eyes softening as they fell on Amara crouched there still, clutching the scrub brush as if it were a lifeline, her small frame trembling not from fear of him, but from exhaustion, the weight of her reality pressing her down lower than any child should ever have to bend. And before he could stop himself, his voice broke the silence, low and unsteady, betraying a vulnerability he thought he had long buried. "A little girl like you should never have to carry such a heavy world on her shoulders," he whispered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue because he knew he wasn't speaking just to her, but to the boy he once had been, a boy who still lived somewhere deep inside him, broken and waiting for comfort. And when Amara lifted her face, eyes shining with unshed tears, and answered with that trembling question, "But if I don't, who will take care of Mommy?" It was as though someone had hurled a mirror at his chest, shattering every wall he had built around his heart, because in her, he saw himself again, standing beside his mother's bedside, promising her he'd be strong, that he'd find a way, that he'd carry the world if it meant she could rest for even one night without pain. And the memory ripped through him so violently that he had to steady himself against the sink, gasping quietly as he realized that this little girl wasn't just asking a question, she was living his story, reliving his torment, repeating his tragedy, and if he turned away now, if he hardened his heart the way so many had hardened theirs against him when he was a boy, then he would be condemning her to the same lonely, merciless fate that had nearly destroyed him, and the thought of it was unbearable. Because all the money he had, all the power he commanded, all the respect his name carried, none of it had ever healed that part of him, but maybe, just maybe, helping her could. And so he inhaled sharply, his chest burning with the force of a decision that would change not just her life, but his own, as he knelt down slowly, lowering himself to her level, so close he could see the dirt clinging stubbornly beneath her nails, the faint bruise on her wrist from carrying things far too heavy, the wear of a battle she shouldn't have to fight. And in that moment, Ethan realized this was not chance, not coincidence, but destiny confronting him, demanding he make a choice, either remain the cold, detached man he had built himself into, or strip it all away and step into the role he had once prayed someone would step into for him, the role of a protector, a savior, a man who would not walk away. And as his trembling hand reached out to gently take the brush from her small fingers, his voice came out steadier this time, though his heart still raced. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said firmly, and though Amara blinked at him in disbelief, her lip quivering as if she didn't dare trust his promise, he held her gaze with a conviction that burned, knowing full well that this was the moment he chose to break the cycle, to rewrite the ending of the story he had once lived, because history would not repeat itself. Not if he had the power to stop it. Ethan stormed into the cramped janitor's office, the stench of old mop water and bitter coffee thick in the air, his chest heaving with restrained fury, as Mr. Williams sat lazily behind the worn-out desk, sipping from a stained mug as though the world owed him comfort, And when Ethan's cold voice cut through the silence, "Why is a child cleaning your bathrooms?" The older man barely blinked, only shrugged, muttering with disinterest, "Kid wanted money. I gave her work. Better than begging, isn't it?" And that single indifferent sentence snapped something deep inside Ethan, making his hand slam down hard on the desk with a thunderous crack that rattled the half-empty cups and scattered papers, his eyes blazing with a fire Mr. Williams hadn't seen before, his voice sharp, trembling with outrage yet edged with heartbreak as he hissed, "You should be ashamed. Children belong in classrooms, not on their knees scrubbing floors." And for a moment the room grew unbearably tense, the walls closing in with the weight of unspoken truths, as Mr. Williams stammered, his bravado cracking when recognition dawned, when the reality that this was not just an angry stranger but the very CEO every teacher had been whispering about, the man the entire school had prepared to welcome with handshakes and smiles, now standing here like a storm threatening to rip the roof off, demanding accountability with a force no one could deny. And Ethan leaned forward, his voice lower but far more dangerous, asking, "Did you ever stop to think what this does to her dignity? To her childhood? Or were you so consumed by your petty need for cheap labor that you forgot she is a child?" And each word echoed like a hammer striking stone, dragging Mr. Williams deeper into a pit of shame he could not climb out of, the janitor fumbling for excuses that collapsed before they even left his lips, while Ethan's mind flashed back to nights of his own childhood, when his small hands ached from scrubbing his mother's tears off cracked kitchen tiles, when he too had traded innocence for survival, and now, seeing Amara forced into that same cycle, it felt like history clawing its way back to torment him, fueling his rage into something almost unbearable, his fists tightening at his side as he declared, "I will not stand by and watch another child suffer the way I did." And Mr. Williams, pale and cornered, muttered apologies, his eyes darting everywhere but Ethan's, but the damage had already been carved into the air, the guilt thick and suffocating, as Ethan stepped back, his chest rising and falling in heavy breaths, staring down the trembling man with disgust that could crush a soul, before finally turning toward the door, his thoughts spinning not just with anger, but with an urgent question clawing at his heart. How could he undo what had already been done? How could he take the sting of humiliation from that little girl's memory? How could he erase the scars of being treated as less than human, when he himself had never fully erased his own? And as the door creaked open behind him, the silence of the hallway waiting, the cliffhanger burned brighter than ever. Ethan knew he had to act, but how would he fix the damage already done? That evening, Ethan stepped into the dimly lit room of Amara's home, and the scent of damp walls mixed with the faint aroma of boiled herbs hung in the air, tugging at his chest with a heaviness he hadn't felt in years. Grace Johnson, frail and pale, tried to push herself up from the sagging sofa, but the weight of her illness nearly pulled her back down, and Ethan's instinct moved quicker than thought as he steadied her trembling frame, watching her eyes struggle to hold dignity even while her body betrayed her, her voice breaking as she whispered that she had begged Amara not to bother strangers, not to make their hardship public, not to add shame on top of suffering. But Ethan silenced her with a firm yet gentle hand pressed on her shoulder, his tone carrying the authority of a man used to commanding boardrooms, but softened with a warmth that startled even himself, assuring her that managing somehow was no longer their fate, not when he had the power to change it, not when he had already seen the bruises poverty had left on their lives. Amara, clutching her mother's weathered hand with tiny fingers that still bore faint traces of soap from scrubbing school floors, leaned closer, her childish whisper trembling with reverence and hope as she said, "Mommy, he's the man I told you about, the one who found me." And Grace's eyes welled with a storm of emotions, shame for having her daughter seen in servitude, gratitude that fate had placed this stranger in their path, and a fragile flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, life could turn toward light after so many years in shadow, while Ethan, watching the scene, felt his carefully guarded heart stir with emotions he hadn't let surface since his own mother's death, and he silently vowed that this was not going to be a passing act of sympathy, not a momentary bandage for wounds that needed real healing, but as Grace's frail voice cracked again, half apology, half disbelief, asking why a man of his stature would care for a child like Amara. Ethan straightened, his jaw firm, his eyes soft, and in that instant he knew he had crossed an invisible line, one that bound him to their future in ways he couldn't yet name. But the unanswered question lingered like a cliff at the edge of his resolve. Would he truly follow through, or had his words just been the comfort of the moment, destined to fade with the night? Days later, the city awoke to a quiet transformation in one small corner of life, where hope had once seemed impossible. For Grace Johnson was no longer lying on a threadbare sofa, gasping for breath, but being gently wheeled into a private hospital whose polished floors and white walls seemed like another world to her, a place she had only heard of but never thought she would step inside, and every arrangement had been made without her even having to lift a finger, because Ethan, true to his quiet word, had handled it all, from the moment the admission papers were signed to the moment the best specialists in the city were called in to review her condition, and he spared no expense in making sure she was treated with dignity rather than pity, as if restoring a piece of her humanity that poverty had stolen, while Amara clutched her mother's hand with wide eyes that sparkled both in fear and in wonder, asking 1,000 questions without speaking a word, yet reassured by the calm nods Ethan gave whenever she looked at him, as though promising silently that nothing bad would happen again. And outside those hospital doors the world seemed to shift for Amara too. For news spread quickly in her school when a formal scholarship letter arrived bearing Ethan's signature and seal, a document that not only guaranteed her education for life but also silenced every whisper that had once mocked her poverty, turning those whispers into gasps of admiration as teachers who once overlooked her now praised her. Students who had snickered at her worn shoes now clapped for her, and even Mr. Williams, the janitor who had made her scrub toilets in exchange for coins, had no choice but to stand stiffly in the background watching as the little girl he exploited became the pride of the school, his shame visible in the way he avoided her gaze. Yet Amara never gloated, for she was too busy holding her scholarship letter to her chest with trembling hands, as if it were a treasure map leading her to a life she never dared dream about. And all the while Ethan said nothing publicly, he made no speeches, gave no interviews, and took no credit, because his heart wasn't chasing applause but something deeper, a healing that he himself couldn't fully explain. And so when the world outside was buzzing with stories of his generosity, he was instead found in the quietest place of all, sitting beside Grace's hospital bed, watching over her with an expression that blended relief with regret, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing as she finally slept peacefully for the first time in years, a sleep not burdened by coughs, unpaid bills, or fear of tomorrow. And in that moment Ethan's mind drifted back to a face he had not spoken of in years. His own mother's face, thin and tired, lost too soon because he hadn't been able to save her when he was still a struggling young man. And as he lowered his head near Grace's bedside, whispering words only he could hear, his voice cracked softly, "Maybe I couldn't save my mother, but I can save hers." And in that quiet confession, a new dawn truly began, not just for Grace and Amara, but for Ethan himself. For in choosing to heal someone else's wounds, he had begun to heal his own, and somewhere deep inside, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that redemption was not just a word, but a life he could actually live. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood that once echoed with silent suffering now held whispers of hope, for Grace was no longer confined to the fragile stillness of her couch, but slowly regaining strength each day. Her steps, uncertain at first yet filled with determination, and when she finally stood tall enough to walk out into the sunlight, Amara rushed forward with all the innocent joy of a child whose world had been restored, her small arms wrapping tightly around Ethan's waist as if afraid to ever let him go again, her voice trembling yet bright with gratitude as she whispered that he had not only saved her mother's life, but given her back the security every child deserved. And Ethan, who had faced boardrooms, empires, and the weight of his own regrets, felt tears sting his eyes at the simplicity and purity of those words, because in that moment he understood something he had spent years overlooking, that wealth measured in coins could build walls and buy comforts, but wealth measured in kindness could heal wounds and rewrite destinies. And as Grace, still frail but radiant with new life, reached for his hand with trembling fingers, she did not speak many words, but her eyes, wet with unshed tears, spoke of gratitude so deep it could not be repaid in a lifetime. And Ethan realized he had not only stepped into their home, he had stepped into their hearts, binding himself to them in a way that was more lasting than contracts or fortunes. And as they walked through the narrow streets together, Grace steadying herself on one side, Amara skipping with renewed laughter on the other, the neighbors who once looked at the Johnson family with pity now gazed with admiration, whispering among themselves how a stranger had done more for them than those who knew them for years. And some even felt shame for turning away when Grace struggled, yet others felt inspired to extend a hand where they once stayed silent, and Ethan, though unused to such public attention, found no pride in their stares, only humility, because he was beginning to see that perhaps his greatest empire was not in skyscrapers, but in lives touched by compassion. And as Amara squeezed his hand and told him that he was not just rich but good, he almost faltered with emotion, hearing in her voice an echo of the child he once had been, the boy who had watched helplessly as his own mother faded without anyone stepping in to save her, and he whispered softly to himself, a vow only his heart could fully understand, that he had finally broken the cycle of loss, that he had redeemed the helplessness of his past by changing someone else's future. And when the setting sun painted their path in hues of gold and amber, Ethan felt for the first time in years that he belonged not to a life of empty victories but to a story that mattered, a story where kindness was the true currency, and love the only lasting investment. And though he knew challenges would come again, he also knew that with every step taken beside Grace and Amara, he had found a new family, a new purpose, and a new dawn that no amount of money could ever replace. And as their silhouettes stretched against the fading light, three figures bound by fate and healed by compassion, the world seemed quieter, kinder, and infinitely richer, until the final truth settled in his heart, that sometimes the richest hearts belong not to those who count money, but to those who count humanity.